Hey guys! Tonight we begin with a road, or at least that's what people like to call it. In reality, it wasn't a single road at all. It was a loose, shifting network of paths, tracks, and dusty caravan trails that stretched across half the known world. But the Silk Road sounds far more romantic than the occasionally muddy, sometimes frozen, often confusing network of trade routes. So the name stuck. It's the kind of thing you picture in your head as a single winding ribbon of stone, but in truth, it was more like a spider web. Strands going north, south, splitting, rejoining, and sometimes disappearing into the desert. And it wasn't even called the Silk Road until the 19th century, when a German geographer decided it needed a catchy title. The merchants who actually used it never thought of it that way. They just went from one market town to the next, following the goods, the gossip, and the occasional rumor of a better deal somewhere over the horizon. Silk was the star, of course. Soft, shimmering, impossibly light. And for centuries, a Chinese secret guarded so fiercely that smuggling silkworm eggs out of the empire could get you killed. In Rome, silk was the height of luxury. Senators complained it was too sheer and morally corrupting, which naturally only made it more desirable, because nothing sells quite like a moral panic. But silk was only part of the story. Spices, glassware, paper, precious stones, and horses all made the journey. And along with them came ideas, religions, technologies, art styles, slipping quietly from one culture to another. The geography was a test of patience and endurance. You could skirt the Taklamakan Desert to the north, where the nights could freeze you solid and the days could roast you alive, or take the south route through mountain passes that made you question your life choices. Rivers flooded without warning, sandstorms swallowed entire caravans, and in the high passes, even the yaks looked like they'd rather be somewhere else.
Long before the Silk Road became the Silk Road, there were already threads of connection. The Persians had their royal road. The Greeks had their sea routes. But it was during the Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century BCE, that the network truly began to take shape. The Han were dealing with the Xiongnu, a nomadic confederation that was more than a little troublesome, and in trying to secure alliances, they sent envoys west. Those envoys came back with tales of strange lands, fine horses, and markets full of goods China didn't have. And just like that, the idea of linking east and west became more than a dream. The people who made it work weren't just merchants. There were caravan leaders who knew every oasis by heart, translators who could smooth over a deal in 3 languages, innkeepers who offered a bed that was only mildly infested with fleas, and yes, the occasional bandit who considered himself part of the supply chain. Entire towns thrived on servicing the caravans, selling food, fodder, and a place to rest before the next stretch of road. The animals were as important as the people. Camels were the undisputed stars, able to carry heavy loads, go days without water, and glare at you with the kind of disdain only a camel can manage. Horses were prized in the grasslands, and in the mountains, yaks and mules took over. Without them, the Silk Road would have been little more than a nice idea. Traveling it was not for the faint of heart. Sandstorms, blizzards, landslides, and the occasional war breaking out right where you needed to pass were all part of the experience. Journeys could take months, even years. If there had been a delivery service, it would have been called Amazon eventually. Under the Han Dynasty, the Silk Road entered its first golden age. Chinese silk reached as far as the Roman Empire. Roman glassware and silver made their way east. In between, Central Asian kingdoms grew rich as middlemen, taxing caravans, offering protection, and occasionally deciding to keep the goods for themselves, a kind of aggressive customs policy. And so the road, or rather the web, kept growing. Goods moved, ideas moved, people moved. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a merchant might have stood at the edge of a desert at dawn, watching the first light hit the sand, knowing that ahead lay weeks of travel, countless deals to be made, and stories to be carried from one end of the world to the other.
The first thing you notice moving west from China is how quickly the landscape changes. One day you're in a fertile river valley, the next you're staring at a wall of sand that seems to go on forever. The Taklamakan Desert doesn't bother with subtlety. It's vast, it's dry, and it has a reputation for swallowing travelers whole. The smart caravans skirt its edges, hopping from oasis to oasis like stepping stones. Each one is a small miracle, a patch of green, a cluster of mud brick houses, a well that keeps everyone alive. These oases aren't just pit stops, they're little worlds of their own. Kashgar, for example, sits at the crossroads where the northern and southern Silk Road routes meet again after circling the desert. By the time you reach it, you've been on the road for weeks, maybe months. The market here is a riot of goods and languages: Chinese silk, Persian glass, Indian spices, Central Asian horses. You can hear deals being struck in half a dozen tongues, none of them quite trusting the others, but all of them understanding the universal language of profit. From Kashgar, the road can take you into the Pamir Mountains. The passes are high, the air is thin, and the path is more suggestion than road. Snow can fall even in summer, and the wind has a way of making you feel like you've made some questionable life choices. But the views are the kind you remember. Jagged peaks, valleys carved by rivers that look like silver threads from above, and the occasional herd of yaks watching you with mild suspicion. Once you're through the mountains, the terrain opens into the grasslands of Central Asia. Here, the caravans share the road with nomadic herders. Horses are the currency of choice, and the locals breed them for speed, strength, and endurance. Chinese envoys once called them heavenly horses, and they were worth their weight in gold, sometimes literally. Deals are struck over campfires, with fermented mare's milk passed around in bowls, and if you're lucky, you leave with a string of horses that will make you rich at the next market. The cities here are different from the oases. Samarkand and Bukhara, for example, are not just waypoints, they're destinations. Even in these early centuries, they're centers of learning, trade, and craftsmanship. The streets are lined with workshops where artisans hammer metal, weave cloth, and carve wood. The air smells of spices and smoke, and the sound of haggling is constant but never hurried. People here know the caravans will keep coming. The road is their lifeline, and they treat it with the kind of respect that comes from knowing it can vanish if neglected. Moving further west, the goods change hands again and again. Silk that left China months ago might now be in the hands of a Sogdian merchant, who will sell it to a Persian trader, who will pass it to someone bound for the ports of the eastern Mediterranean. Along the way, the bolts of cloth pick up stories: who carried them, what storms they survived, which bandits they narrowly escaped. By the time they reach a Roman villa, they've traveled farther than most people will in their entire lives. And it's not just goods making the journey. Monks from India carry scrolls of Buddhist teachings, stopping in Central Asian monasteries to translate them into new languages. Persian musicians bring instruments eastward, their melodies slowly weaving into Chinese court music. Even recipes travel. A spice from one end of the road finds its way into a stew at the other, and no one remembers exactly where it came from, only that it tastes right. The road is never the same twice. A war in one region can close a pass for years. A new alliance can open a safer route. A drought can turn an oasis into a ghost town, but the flow always finds a way. Merchants adjust, caravans reroute, and the Silk Road bends without breaking. By the time you've followed it this far, you realize it's less a road and more a living thing, shifting, adapting, breathing with the rise and fall of the empires it connects. And somewhere ahead, beyond more deserts, more mountains, and more markets, lies the western edge of the known world, where silk will meet marble and spices will meet wine. The first thing you notice is the change in the air. The dry, thin mountain wind gives way to something softer, scented faintly with herbs and smoke from distant hearths. The markets here are different too. Less about survival goods, more about luxury. In the cities of Persia, the stalls are heavy with silverwork, fine carpets, carved ivory, and glassware that catches the light like captured water. Silk from China is here, but it's no longer the raw bolts that left the looms in the East. By now, it's been cut, dyed, embroidered, and turned into garments fit for a king's court. Persia has always been a crossroads. Long before the Silk Road had a name, the old Achaemenid Empire had built the Royal Road, a network of stations and rest stops that made it possible to send messages across the empire in days instead of weeks. That infrastructure never really went away. The empires that followed, Parthian, Sasanian, kept the routes alive, taxing the caravans and offering protection in exchange. It was a practical arrangement. Merchants got safer passage, rulers got richer, and the road kept humming. The Persians were more than middlemen. They were refiners, adapters, and cultural translators. Goods from the East were repackaged here, sometimes literally, sometimes in the sense of being reimagined for new tastes. A Chinese lacquer box might be inlaid with Persian silver. A Central Asian horse might be trained for the kind of cavalry maneuvers Persian generals preferred. Even ideas were reshaped. Buddhist art from India took on Persian stylistic flourishes before moving further west. From the Persian plateau, the road splits again. One branch heads south toward the ports of the Persian Gulf, where goods can be loaded onto ships bound for Arabia, East Africa, and eventually the Mediterranean. Another heads northwest toward the Anatolian Plateau and the cities that feed into the great markets of the Roman world. Both are busy, both are dangerous in their own ways. The southern route risks storms at sea and pirates. The northern route risks mountain snows and the occasional army deciding that your caravan looks like an easy source of supplies. Travelers heading toward the Mediterranean often pass through cities like Ctesiphon, the Sasanian capital, where the great arch of the royal palace rises above the city like a frozen wave of stone. Here, the road feels less like a dusty trail and more like a grand boulevard. Diplomats, scholars, soldiers, and merchants all mingle in the same streets. You can hear Greek, Aramaic, Persian, and a dozen other languages in the space of a single market square. The goods keep changing hands. The first thing you notice when you start paying attention to the people is how varied they are. A caravan might include a wealthy merchant dressed in fine wool, a handful of hired guards with mismatched armor, a translator who speaks 3 languages fluently and another 5 badly, and a cook who can make a passable stew out of whatever the last town sold them. There might be a monk carrying a bundle of scrolls, a craftsman hoping to sell his work in a distant city, and a few travelers who have no clear reason for being there except that they heard the road was going somewhere interesting. Merchants were the backbone. Some specialized in one thing, silk, spices, horses, while others traded whatever was profitable that season. They knew the rhythms of the road, when the passes would be clear, when the markets would be busy, when the bandits would be hungriest. They also knew how to read a customer, whether that customer was a Roman senator's agent or a farmer from a small oasis town. A good merchant could make a deal without speaking a word of the other person's language, relying on gestures, smiles, and the universal language of weighing silver in the palm. Then there were the monks. Buddhism in particular traveled the Silk Road like a quiet passenger, carried by monks from India into Central Asia and China. They stopped at monasteries along the way, translating texts into new languages, adapting teachings to local customs. Some of these monasteries became famous rest stops for caravans, not just for spiritual reasons, but because they offered food, shelter, and a safe place to sleep without worrying about thieves. A merchant might not care much about enlightenment, but he'd happily donate a little coin to a monastery that kept his goods safe for the night. Envoys and diplomats also moved along the road, though they traveled with more ceremony. They carried letters sealed with wax, gifts from one ruler to another, and the kind of polite lies that keep empires from going to war. Their caravans were smaller but better guarded, and they often traveled faster using fresh horses at each stop. Still, even they had to deal with the same dust, the same heat, and the same questionable food as everyone else. And then there were the wanderers, the people who didn't quite fit into any category. Some were adventurers looking for fortune, others were scholars chasing rumors of lost books or rare plants. A few were simply restless souls who couldn't stay in one place. They might start as guards or cooks in a caravan, then drift away to join another, slowly making their way from one end of the world to the other without ever really meaning to. The road had its own kind of social order. At the top were the wealthy merchants and envoys who could afford the best animals, the safest routes, and the most comfortable lodgings. Below them were the smaller traders who might only travel a few hundred miles before selling their goods to someone else. Then came the laborers, the porters, the animal handlers, the cooks who kept everything moving. And finally, the hangers-on, storytellers, musicians, healers, and the occasional con artist who could talk their way into a free meal. Every stop along the road was a meeting point for these people. In the markets, you could see a Persian trader haggling with a Chinese silk merchant while a Sogdian interpreter tried to keep up. In the inns, you might find a Buddhist monk sharing a table with a Roman glassmaker, both nodding politely while neither understood a word the other said. And in the courtyards, under the shade of date palms, deals were struck with a handshake and a promise that might or might not be kept.
The road changed the people who traveled it. A merchant who started in Xi'an might end up wearing a Persian-style robe and eating bread baked in a Central Asian oven. A monk from India might pick up a few words of Chinese and develop a taste for fermented mare's milk. Even the guards, who were often the most practical-minded, might carry home a trinket from a far-off market, a reminder that they'd been somewhere most people could only imagine. And in the end, it was these people, not the goods, who carried the Silk Road's real cargo. They brought stories, songs, recipes, and ideas. They carried news of distant wars and rumors of strange lands. They were the living threads that tied the far ends of the world together, weaving a fabric far more enduring than silk. The stability began in the east with the Tang Dynasty. China was wealthy, confident, and open to the world in a way that made the Silk Road hum with activity. Chang'an, the Tang capital, was a city of wide avenues, bustling markets, and neighborhoods where you could hear half a dozen languages before you'd walked a single street. Foreign merchants were not just tolerated, they were part of the city's fabric. You could buy Persian silverware, Indian spices, and Central Asian horses without leaving the city walls. In the West, the Byzantine Empire still held sway over the Eastern Mediterranean, and though it had its share of political headaches, it provided a stable endpoint for goods arriving from the East. Between them lay a patchwork of Central Asian kingdoms, many of them ruled by the Sogdians, master traders who seemed to have been born knowing how to strike a deal. They spoke the languages of their neighbors, knew the customs of every market, and could move goods from one end of the road to the other with an efficiency that would make a modern logistics company jealous. The Sogdians were more than just middlemen. They were cultural brokers. A caravan arriving in Samarkand might carry silk from China, glass from Syria, spices from India, and furs from the steppes. By the time those goods left again, they might be repackaged, combined, or redirected entirely. A bolt of silk could be sold to a Persian merchant who would dye it in colors fashionable in the West before sending it on to Constantinople. A shipment of spices might be split, with some going south to the Arabian ports and some heading north toward the Black Sea.
The road itself was dotted with caravanserais, fortified inns spaced a day's journey apart. They were more than just places to sleep. They were hubs of information where news traveled faster than the caravans themselves. A merchant could arrive in the evening, share a meal with strangers, and by morning know which routes were safe, which markets were flooded with cheap goods, and which towns were suddenly charging higher taxes. This was also the era when religions traveled with particular ease. Buddhism continued its eastward journey, Islam spread rapidly across Central Asia, and Nestorian Christianity found small but enduring communities far from its origins. In the markets, you could see a Buddhist monk in saffron robes walking past a Muslim scholar in a white turban, both deep in thought, both entirely at home in the same city. Art and technology moved just as freely. Chinese papermaking reached the Islamic world, where it transformed scholarship and record-keeping. Persian designs influenced Chinese ceramics. Musical instruments crossed borders, sometimes changing shape and sound along the way. A lute in one city might be a pipa in another, its music adapted to local tastes. For a time, the road felt almost inevitable, as if it had always been there and always would be. Caravans moved in steady rhythm, the oases thrived, and the cities along the way grew rich. But even in this golden age, the Silk Road was never without its risks. A sudden war between two kingdoms could close a route overnight. A drought could turn a dependable oasis into a dry hollow. Bandits still prowled the less guarded stretches, and every merchant knew that a successful journey was never guaranteed. Still, for those who traveled it, this was the moment when the Silk Road seemed to stretch without interruption from the gates of Chang'an to the harbors of the Mediterranean. A merchant could set out from one end with a reasonable hope of reaching the other, and along the way, the road would offer not just profit, but a glimpse of the world's astonishing variety.
The first cracks appeared quietly. A war here, a rebellion there. Nothing that stopped the caravans entirely, but enough to make merchants think twice about certain routes. The Tang Dynasty, which had been so open and confident, began to face internal unrest and pressure from nomadic powers on its borders. In the west, the Byzantine Empire was shrinking, its resources stretched thin. The Middle Kingdom's once stable waypoints sometimes found themselves caught between larger powers, and the road bent and twisted to avoid trouble. The rise of the Islamic caliphates reshaped the map. At first, this was good for trade. The early Abbasid period brought stability across a vast stretch of territory from North Africa to Central Asia. Baghdad became a glittering hub where goods from China, India, and the Mediterranean all converged. But as the centuries passed, unity fractured. Rival dynasties, shifting alliances, and local conflicts meant that the once smooth flow of goods was now a series of cautious steps, with merchants constantly recalculating their paths. Some routes simply faded. A city that had thrived for centuries could be bypassed in a single season if a safer or cheaper alternative appeared. Oases that had been lifelines for caravans dried up, forcing detours that added weeks to a journey. And in the high passes, the same snow and rock slides that had always been there now seemed more dangerous without the backing of strong, stable states to keep the roads clear and the bandits in check. Banditry itself became a bigger problem. In the Golden Age, a caravanserai might have been a safe haven, its walls enough to deter trouble. Now, some of those same inns were abandoned, their courtyards overgrown, their wells dry. Merchants began to travel in larger groups, hiring more guards, which made the journeys safer, but also more expensive. The profit margins shrank, and some traders decided it was better to stick to regional routes rather than risk the long haul.
And yet, the Silk Road didn't die, it adapted. When overland routes became too dangerous, more goods moved by sea. The maritime Silk Road, hugging the coasts of China, Southeast Asia, India, and the Arabian Peninsula, grew busier. Ports like Guangzhou, Calicut, and Aden became as important as Samarkand or Kashgar had once been. The cargoes were the same: silk, spices, ceramics, precious metals. But the crews were different, the dangers different. Instead of sandstorms and mountain passes, there were monsoons and pirates. In Central Asia, new powers rose and fell. The Karakhanids, the Khwarezmian Empire, the Seljuks, each took a turn controlling key stretches of the road. Some encouraged trade, lowering taxes and protecting caravans. Others saw merchants as easy prey, squeezing them for every coin. The road's pulse quickened or slowed depending on who held the passes and the oases. Even in these more turbulent centuries, the Silk Road remained a cultural artery. Scholars still traveled, carrying books and ideas. Pilgrims still made their way to holy sites. Musicians, artists, and craftsmen still found new influences in distant markets. The road might have been less predictable, but it was still alive, still breathing, still connecting worlds that would otherwise have remained strangers. If you stood in a caravanserai courtyard during this time, you might hear a different tone in the conversations. Less talk of expansion, more of caution. Merchants comparing notes on which routes were safe this season, which towns were charging too much, which passes were blocked by snow. The optimism of the Golden Age had faded, replaced by a kind of pragmatic endurance. The road was no longer a promise, it was a gamble. And yet, the gamble was still worth it. A single successful journey could make a merchant's fortune. A rare cargo could change the fashions of an entire court. And for some, the pull of the road was as much about curiosity as profit. Even in its more dangerous years, the Silk Road still offered the chance to see the world in all its variety, to taste foods you'd never imagined, to hear music in scales you'd never known, to meet people whose lives were nothing like your own.
When the Mongols arrived in the 13th century, they didn't just nudge the map, they redrew it entirely. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongol Empire stretched from the shores of the Pacific to the edges of Eastern Europe. For the first and only time, nearly the entire length of the Silk Road lay under the control of a single power. It was an empire built with terrifying speed and maintained with a mixture of ruthless discipline and surprisingly practical governance. For merchants, this was both unsettling and oddly reassuring. The Mongols were not sentimental, but they understood the value of trade. They wanted goods to move, taxes to be paid, and information to flow. A caravan that paid its dues and followed the rules could travel from China to Persia with a level of safety that hadn't been seen in generations. The Mongols even established a relay system, the Yam, with stations stocked with fresh horses, food, and shelter. Messages and goods could move faster than ever before, and the road took on a new rhythm. The cities along the route flourished again. Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar bustled with activity. Markets were full, caravanserais were busy, and the air was thick with the smell of spices, leather, and cooking fires. You could hear Persian, Chinese, Arabic, and Mongolian spoken in the same square. Scholars traveled alongside merchants, carrying books and ideas. Artisans moved to new cities, bringing their skills with them. The road was alive in a way it hadn't been for a long time. But the Mongol peace, the Pax Mongolica, came at a price. The same roads that carried silk and spices also carried armies, and the same efficiency that sped up trade also sped up the spread of disease. In the mid-14th century, the Black Death traveled along these routes, moving from Asia into Europe with devastating speed. A merchant's caravan could bring wealth to a city, but it could also bring something far deadlier. Even so, the Mongol period left a lasting mark on the Silk Road. The empire's sheer size and its emphasis on connectivity meant that ideas, technologies, and goods moved in ways that reshaped entire regions. Gunpowder, printing techniques, and new navigational tools spread westward. Artistic styles blended in unexpected ways. Chinese motifs appearing in Persian manuscripts, Islamic geometric patterns influencing designs in the East. For a time, it seemed as if the Silk Road might remain this open, this connected indefinitely. But empires, like caravans, eventually slow down. The Mongol Empire began to fracture, its unity splintering into smaller khanates. The safe passage that had been the road's greatest gift became less certain. Taxes rose, protection waned, and the familiar pattern returned. Merchants weighing the risks, routes shifting, and the road adapting once again.
The decline didn't happen all at once. It never does. It began quietly, with small shifts that didn't seem like much at the time. A new sea route here, a political change there. Merchants still traveled, caravans still moved, but the balance was tilting. The overland Silk Road had always been vulnerable to the rise and fall of empires, and now the empires that had kept it alive were changing. In the East, the Ming Dynasty came to power in China in the late 14th century. The Ming court was cautious, inward-looking compared to the Mongols before them. They still traded, but they preferred to control it tightly, limiting foreign contact and focusing on tribute missions rather than open exchange. The great maritime expeditions of Zheng He in the early 15th century showed that China could project power far across the seas. But once those voyages ended, the court turned its attention back inward. In the West, the Byzantine Empire was gone, replaced by the rising Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans controlled key choke points between Asia and Europe, and they knew the value of that control. They taxed goods heavily, making overland trade more expensive. At the same time, European kingdoms were beginning to look for ways to bypass the middle entirely. If they could sail directly to the sources of silk and spices, they could avoid the long chain of middlemen that made those goods so costly. The Portuguese were the first to find a way. In the late 15th century, Vasco da Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and reached India by sea. It was longer in distance, but faster in time, and ships could carry far more cargo than a caravan. Soon, other European powers followed: Spain, the Dutch, the English, each carving out their own maritime routes. The Silk Road didn't vanish, but it was no longer the fastest or most profitable way to move goods between East and West. The cities along the road felt the change. Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, they still had markets, still saw caravans, but the flow was thinner. Caravanserais that had once been full every night now had empty rooms. Some routes fell into disuse entirely, their wells drying up, their roads swallowed by sand. The great oases became quieter, their prosperity fading like the paint on their old market walls. Even so, the road didn't die completely. Regional trade continued. Silk still moved, though more often to nearby markets than across continents. Spices, ceramics, and textiles still found buyers. And ideas still traveled. Slower, perhaps, but still carried by merchants, pilgrims, and wanderers who preferred the land to the sea.
There was also a shift in what the road carried. With the great powers focusing on maritime trade, the overland routes became more important for goods that were too fragile, too valuable, or too secret to risk on a long sea voyage. Rare manuscripts, delicate works of art, and certain luxury items still made the journey by camel and horse. The road became less of a highway and more of a specialist's path, quieter but still alive. If you stood in a caravanserai courtyard in these later centuries, you'd notice the difference. Fewer languages in the air, Fewer animals in the stables, fewer guards at the gates. The conversations would be about local markets, not distant ports. The road was no longer the artery that connected the known world. It was a network of smaller veins, still carrying life, but no longer the lifeblood it had once been. And yet there's something fitting about that. The Silk Road had always been adaptable. It had survived wars, droughts, and the rise and fall of empires. Now it was surviving in a quieter way, shrinking back into the regions that had always sustained it, waiting for whatever came next. By the time the great maritime powers had carved their sea lanes across the globe, the overland Silk Road was no longer the main artery of east-west trade. But roads, once worn into the earth, have a way of staying. The caravan tracks were still there, the oases still dotted the deserts, and the cities that had grown fat on trade still stood, quieter perhaps, but not abandoned. In Central Asia, towns like Samarkand and Bukhara remained important regional centers. Their markets still bustled, though now the goods were more likely to be from nearby provinces than from the far ends of the continent. The caravanserais still opened their gates at night, but the travelers were fewer, their journeys shorter. The road had shifted from being a global connector to a network of local lifelines. The cultural legacy was harder to see, but deeper to feel. Languages along the old routes carried loanwords from far-off places, a reminder of centuries of exchange. Recipes blended ingredients from different climates, so that a dish in one city might have spices from another continent without anyone thinking it unusual. Artistic styles bore the fingerprints of distant influences: a Persian motif in Chinese porcelain, a Central Asian pattern in Ottoman textiles, a hint of Indian rhythm in a Mediterranean melody. Religions, too, bore the marks of the road. Buddhist monasteries in China preserved texts that had traveled from India. Islamic architecture in Central Asia carried echoes of Persian and Arab styles. Even Christianity in its various forms had left small, enduring communities far from its birthplace. The Silk Road had been a corridor not just for goods, but for belief, and those beliefs had taken root in unexpected soil. In some places, the road's memory became part of local identity. Families traced their ancestry to merchants who had once crossed deserts and mountains. Legends grew around famous travelers, Marco Polo in the west, Xuanzang in the east, their journeys retold until they blurred into folklore. The road itself became a kind of myth, a symbol of connection and adventure, even for those who had never seen it. By the 19th century, the old Silk Road was attracting a new kind of traveler: explorers, archaeologists, and imperial agents. They came not to trade, but to map, to dig, and to claim. The ruins of caravanserais, the faded murals in desert caves, the fragments of manuscripts buried in sand, all became objects of fascination. In their own way, these outsiders were part of the road's afterlife, carrying pieces of its history into museums and libraries far from where they had been made. Even in the modern era, the Silk Road never truly disappeared. Railways and highways sometimes followed its old paths. New borders cut across it, but trade, legal or otherwise, still moved along its bones. And in the 21st century, the name itself has been revived, used for projects and policies that promise to reconnect the continents, as if invoking the old road might bring back some of its magic. If you stand today in one of the old Silk Road cities, you can still feel it. In the market, where goods from different regions sit side by side, in the architecture, where styles from different centuries and cultures meet in the same building, in the faces of the people, shaped by generations of mingling. The caravans may be gone, but the road is still there, not just in the earth, but in the way the world fits together. The day begins in the cool blue light before dawn. The camp is quiet, except for the soft shifting of animals
and the low murmur of voices as the first fires are lit. You can smell bread baking somewhere, the faint sweetness of tea leaves steeping in a battered pot. The air is cold enough to make you pull your cloak tighter, but you know it won't stay that way for long. The caravan moves slowly at first, the camels swaying into their rhythm, the horses tossing their heads. The road ahead is a pale ribbon in the sand, marked by the footprints of those who passed before you. On either side, the land stretches out in muted colors: gold, brown, the occasional green where water hides just below the surface. The sun rises behind you, and the shadows grow shorter. By midday, the heat has settled in. The air shimmers above the ground, and the sound of bells on the lead camel seems to hang in it like a thread. You pass a small group heading the other way. Their faces are sunburned, their clothes dusty, but they smile as they pass. A few words are exchanged, mostly about the road ahead, the price of grain, the state of the next well. Then they're gone, swallowed by the horizon. In the afternoon, the road dips toward an oasis. You can see the green long before you reach it. Palms swaying, the glint of water, the low walls of a settlement. The air smells different here, cooler, touched with the scent of growing things. Children watch from doorways as the caravan passes, and merchants call out from shaded stalls, offering dates, figs, and bolts of cloth. You stop long enough to drink, to rest in the shade, to hear the latest news from a place you've never seen.
As the sun begins to sink, the caravan makes camp. Fires are lit, and the smell of cooking drifts through the air. Rice, lentils, a hint of spice from someone's private store. People sit in small groups, talking quietly, mending harnesses, checking loads. A musician takes out a stringed instrument and begins to play, the notes soft and unhurried. Somewhere, a storyteller begins a tale, and the circle around him grows. The stars come out slowly, one by one, until the sky is full. The road is invisible now, but you know it's there, stretching on into the dark, leading to cities you've only heard of, markets you can barely imagine. You think of the goods you're carrying, silk, spices, glass, paper, and of the hands they'll pass through before they reach their final homes. You think of the people you've met, the languages you've heard, the landscapes you've crossed, and you realize that by the time you reach the other end, you won't be the same person who set out. The road changes you, not in sudden ways, but in the slow accumulation of sights, sounds, and stories. It weaves you into itself, just as it has done for countless travelers before you. Somewhere in the dark, a camel shifts and sighs. The firelight flickers on the faces around you. The night is quiet, but the road is still there, waiting for morning, waiting for the next step.